Hi everyone, I'm Melissa Deininger, and my research centers around the long 19th century in France, which starts with the French Revolution and typically concludes around World War I. My work focuses mainly on the Revolution's impact on subsequent political and historical events in France. I want to start my talk today with a very brief overview of the French Revolution. I won't go into too much detail, but it's impossible to understand Chénier's life and his importance to the Romantics without knowing some basics of the Revolution. Let's start with some background of the Revolution. In the years leading up to 1789, France suffered several economic hardships. The main issues were poor harvests, widespread unemployment, and massive national debt. The debt is typically ascribed to royal extravagances, although these are often exaggerated in historical stories, and support of foreign wars, including our own American Revolution. In this British cartoon from the period, you can see an assembly of French noblemen as they gluttonously feast on various meats. The signs list substitutions for bread, which was in short supply due to bad weather and failed crops. The bread alternatives include venison, roast beef, and turtle soup, items that only the wealthy could afford. The attitude of indifference to the crowd gathered outside the window is similar to the statement ascribed to Marie Antoinette of, "Let them eat cake." The Queen reportedly uttered this phrase when told that the people had no bread. The quote was actually created by her detractors, but it does show the perceived indifference and lack of understanding on the part of the aristocracy in the face of France's suffering. In May of 1789, King Louis XVI called the Estates General, which was an assembly representing the three classes in France: the clergy, the nobles, and everyone else. The clergy and nobles were typically from the same families and made up only 3% of the population, but they controlled most of the country's wealth. The two groups also tended to vote together, thus overruling the common third estate. This was the first time that the Estates General had been called since 1614, which points to the gravity of the problems in France in 1789. The Third Estate, made mainly of professional men, like lawyers, doctors, and wealthy merchants, became frustrated at the non-existence of real-life solutions proposed and the lack of voice they had, due to the first two estates voting as a bloc. On June 20th, the deputies found that their meeting space was locked and feared that they were being cut out of the decision-making. They relocated to a nearby tennis court and declared themselves the National Assembly. It is important to note that they were not intended to be locked out of the space, but their fears of being ignored were valid in context. The tennis court oath represents the first time that French citizens formally opposed Louis XVI. The Bastille prison in Paris had long stood as a symbol of royal oppression, with many political prisoners held there in exchange for money or aristocratic favor. Parisians, who were already worked up over the fairly disastrous Estates General and the dismissal of a popular finance minister, believed that political prisoners were being tortured and killed in the prison. One of the prison's most infamous detainees, the Marquis de Sade, had been shouting out provocative statements to this effect just days before, when he was transferred to another site. A large mob descended on the Bastille and tore it to the ground, marking the first major salvo in the revolution. Indeed, the storming of the Bastille later becomes the national holiday, marking France's independence. Unfortunately for the crowd, there were very few prisoners held in the Bastille at the time, because the Crown had already decided that the prison was not a useful facility. At Versailles, the king's diary entry for the 14th is simply rien. He noted nothing of value. as his hunting that day had been poor. By the time it became clear, a few days later, that the Bastille had been a significant event, the king agreed to reinstate the finance minister, and he returned temporarily to Paris from Versailles. While the king seemed oblivious to the coming changes, many nobles saw the Bastille as writing on the wall and began to emigrate in large numbers. Things in France calmed down for a short period following the Bastille. In August 1789, the National Assembly created the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. The declaration is very similar in tone to our Bill of Rights and declares that the basis of the nation is the citizen, shifting power from the monarchy to the people. While things seemed to be calm in the political world, not everyone was happy with the lack of tangible changes. Many groups began thinking about future demonstrations. In October, a group of women in Paris, largely fishmongers and other market sellers, became very upset that the king was back in his country chateau and not in the capital taking care of the nation's continued problems. They worked themselves into a mob and marched to Versailles, demanding that the king return with them. The women invaded the palace and made it as far as the queen's bedroom before the king agreed to go back to Paris. This is one of the first instances of violence directly against the monarchy, and it greatly frightened the royal family, who until then were very much out of reach for the average person. Once again, things calmed down for a while, with few major events in 1790. There was a lot of talk of establishing a constitutional monarchy, similar to what we see in Britain. By mid-1791, despite the political calm, the royal family believed that they would eventually lose power and/or be imprisoned. In late June, the entire family made an ill-conceived attempt to leave the country and join up with royalist forces near the Austrian border. This proved to be the breaking point for many revolutionaries. Most people had supported the idea of keeping some form of monarchy in place, but this flight was seen as treason on the part of the king. The royal family was now kept in official custody as they hoped for foreign intervention to restore their place. The assembly quickly moved forward to abolish the monarchy and proclaim France's first republic. The image most people have of the French Revolution is actually a specific period, known as the Reign of Terror. The term comes from a revolutionary call to, quote, make terror the order of the day, meaning that only violence would be able to rid France of the old regime and clear the path for the new world order, one based on human rights and equality. The king was put on trial and convicted at the beginning of 1793. The trial is largely acknowledged as a sham, and many nobles turned on the king as they saw that the country was undergoing radical change. Louis XVI was publicly guillotined in Paris in January. Queen Marie Antoinette was imprisoned for the majority of 1793, until her trial and execution in October. She was accused of, among other things, incestuous relationships with her children and conspiring with foreign nations. The revolution took on a frenzied pace from September 1793 to July 1794, with people of all walks being accused of anti-revolutionary behavior, resulting in thousands of deaths. While the image of the revolution's terror is typically nobles being led to the guillotine, the reality was that the revolution often turned on itself. Neighbor accused neighbor for personal gain or as part of the frenzy, and political parties began jockeying for ownership of the revolution. The Girondins and the Jacobins emerged as the leading parties, with the Girondins seen as more moderate and wanting to negotiate change. The Jacobins were quite radical and advocated political violence to achieve their goals of a strong, centralized government. The Jacobins were backed by the sans-culotte mob, who were primarily poor Parisians. The Jacobins initiated the Reign of Terror and eventually turned on other political groups, including purging and executing many of the Girondin leaders. The end of the Terror is typically marked by the death of Jacobin leader Maximilien Robespierre, often considered the architect of the revolution's most violent period. This painting shows Robespierre being taken into custody with several political leaders of his party as the revolution shifted away from Jacobin control. The revolution itself continued for several years, but displayed less violence and chaos after 1794. Historians debate an exact end date, but the establishment of the consulate government in 1799 is typically recognized as the end. This means that the French Revolution continued for over 10 years, and it marked a drastic turning point in the country's history and political landscape. Okay, let's move on to our main character. Andrea Chénier was an 18th century French poet and journalist whose work is seen as a precursor to the Romantic movement. Though his career was cut short by the French Revolution, his poetry was primarily published posthumously and influenced later generations of writers. Here are some key facts about Chénier. Born in Constantinople to a French father and a Greek mother, André Chénier spent his early years traveling between France and the Ottoman Empire. His Greek heritage significantly influenced his poetic development and appreciation for classical literature. As you can see from this portrait, he was a member of a wealthy family, and he was brought up with many advantages. Chénier attended school in Paris, where he spent years studying the classics. After leaving school, he briefly joined the army, but had little interest in pursuing a military career and left after a few months. Chénier became a secretary at the French embassy in London, but felt himself to be in exile among strangers. So he returned to Paris in 1790, just as the revolution was gaining steam. He wrote for several newspapers and published a few poems during this period. Chénier initially welcomed the revolution as necessary, but quickly became disgusted with its excesses. André Chénier was involved with the Society of '89 Club, which he had co-founded with Lafayette and other well-known political figures. He also belonged to the Feuillants Club, which broke away from the Jacobins in July 1791. In his works, Chénier defended constitutional monarchy and moderate reform, ideas which had originally been the intent of most early revolutionary politicians. In doing so, he aligned himself with moderate factions, a decision that proved dangerous as the Terror gained control of the nation. In 1792, Chénier assisted Malherbe in the defense of Louis XVI because he opposed the death penalty for the king. Unfortunately for the moderates, Louis XVI was tried as a traitor and condemned to death by the more rabid factions. The following year, Chénier wrote his famous Ode à Marie-Anne Charlotte Corday, a poem based on the young woman who had stabbed Jean-Paul Marat, a well-known and rabid revolutionary. Both of these actions marked Chénier as a counter-revolutionary figure. The poet had a brother who became a well-known politician during the Revolution, serving in the National Convention and voting for the death of Louis XVI. This sort of division was not uncommon for the time, and the brothers were able to maintain their relationship despite their differing political stances. As the revolution became more violent, André Chénier wrote political satires, pamphlets, and articles in a leading newspaper of the time, denouncing many of the Jacobin leaders by name. Robespierre became the main focus of his disdain, cementing the poet's place as a political enemy of the Jacobin leader. After the Girondin party fell, Chénier left Paris for Rouen and Versailles, where he spent his time writing verses and studying. Unable to stay away from the political scene in Paris, Chénier was arrested in March 1794 while visiting friends. The revolutionaries were actually there to arrest the host of the party, but they took the poet into custody and placed him in Saint-Lazare prison, largely based on mistaken identity. Chénier spent 141 days incarcerated, writing poems that he snuck out with his laundry to his family. He remained largely forgotten during his time in Saint-Lazare, which was not uncommon for political prisoners of the period. While imprisoned, Chénier met a young woman named Aimée de Coigny, who served as his muse, leading to his most famous poetry collection, Iam. While the young duchess inspired many of his last poems, the reality was she didn't seem to know who our poet was. Madame de Coigny married a nobleman she met in Saint-Lazare after they were set free. She later wrote a memoir of her life with no mention of Chénier or the verses dedicated to her. Chénier was able to survive by flying below the radar until his father loudly demanded his immediate release. Until this point, André and his brother had made the decision to keep quiet in the hopes that the revolutionaries would forget about him. The renewed interest in his case led to him being brought before the tribunal on July 25, 1794, on charges of counter-revolutionary conspiracy, including fighting for the prince's army. In reality, he was mistaken for his brother, who had served briefly in the army, marking the second time the poet had been a victim of mistaken identity. Chénier was guillotined the same day as his sham trial. Less than 3 days later, Robespierre was overthrown and was himself guillotined, marking the end of the rabid political killings of the Terror. Witnesses report that Chénier and a fellow poet recited verses from Racine to the crowds as they were driven to the guillotine. Next, we'll look at some themes in Chénier's works. André Chénier's poetry was largely unknown during his lifetime. A posthumous edition of his collected work was published in 1819, finding great success with the early Romantics. Chénier's poetry is known for its blend of classical form and romantic sensibility. He drew heavily from the Greek and Roman models, focusing on themes like nature, beauty, and the human condition. This classical influence, with its emphasis on restraint and clarity, made him a unique voice that bridged the gap between the Enlightenment and the emerging Romantic era. His more emotional and personal works, like the prison poem Le Jeune Captive, cemented his legacy as a precursor to the Romantic movement. First, let's look at Ode à Marie-Anne Charlotte Corday, a poem martyrizing the woman who assassinated one of the most rabid Jacobin leaders, Jean-Paul Marat. Corday stabbed Marat in his bath, where he frequently received visitors due to health conditions. The ode is primarily a venomous attack on Marat, who is portrayed in the most vile terms. He is compared to a dark snake living in a disgusting cave, a clear reference to Marat not being able to leave his home. Marat's role in encouraging the Terror is seen with references to his hideous appearance and voracious appetite for victims. The poem shows Corday as a brave force standing up to the tyranny of the revolution. Later stanzas also critique the rest of the country, including the poet himself, for not having her level of courage in standing up to this tyranny. The 1793 painting shows Corday with a knife in her hand and a dead Marat in the background. Let's take a look at Le Jeune Captive. Written while Chénier was imprisoned, this is one of his most famous and moving poems. It was inspired by Aimée de Coigny, a fellow captive who managed to survive the Reign of Terror. I've pulled a few lines from the poem to showcase its themes of defying death and yearning for life and freedom, not unexpected sentiments for the young poet as he languishes in prison. In this poem, the poet claims to overhear the lament of a young woman in prison like himself. He acts as a secretary, recording her pleas. Chénier shows the poetic spirit triumphing over despair, comparing dark and light, the passing of seasons, and finding the beauty in both. In the first selection, you can clearly see that the young woman is like a new flower facing dangers. Next, the poet tells us that some hardships are to be expected, but hope can help you escape any imposed prison. Next, we'll look at some themes found throughout Iam, Chénier's most famous collection. Iam is a collection of 15 poems written while he was imprisoned in Saint-Lazare. The poems describe the events in France from 1792 to 1794, largely focused on what he saw as the Jacobin theft of ideas from antiquity, like justice and liberty. His poems tend to alternate between cold irony and hot passions, reflecting the extremes of the moment. He condemns the terrorists in the name of history and screams against injustice. But the last poems tend to examine the sweetness of life, as the poet faces the likely end of his life approaching. Iam 8 was written the day before Chénier's execution. The first part of the poem rages against the cruelty of the terror, comparing the prisoners to sheep awaiting execution. Chénier warns that even those who seem to be in charge, the shepherds and dogs, are in danger of being engulfed by the machinery of the slaughterhouse. He next talks about being forgotten and accustoming himself to oblivion as he waits to feed the bloody people king. This phrase is a reference both to the revolution's rabid mob mentality and a more poignant reference to Robespierre, who was beginning to take on many characteristics of a mad dictator. In the second part of the poem, Chénier addresses his friends and fellow prisoners, mentioning the comfort they sometimes bring each other, and saying that they have the right to live and be content. Once again, Chénier makes a not-so-veiled reference to Robespierre when he tells his friends to live in spite of ... which was in the original poem. His readers would have easily filled in the Jacobin's name. He ends his final poem by exhorting his friends to live in peace, despite his own resignation to death. In all of these examples, you can see how Chénier uses classical style to address current subjects, creating a connection between the past and present. Historical links were common for many artists of the time. One has only to think of David's neoclassicism, which became the lasting style of the French Revolution. Unfortunately, the Revolution, and specifically the Terror, were abrupt and violent ruptures with the past, leaving contemporary artists on unsteady footing as they tried to express their thoughts. As you can see from his themes and style, Chénier was an immense influence on Romanticism. While his political writings were published during his lifetime, only 2 of his poems were released before his death. The first complete edition of his works appeared just as Romanticism was taking root in France. This timing allowed the Romantics to claim him as one of their own and champion his work as a source of inspiration for the new movement. Chénier shaped Romanticism in both his poetry and the legends surrounding his tragic death. The Romantics were strongly attracted to him because they believed that poets should serve as the conscience of the people. While Chénier worked within the classical tradition, he began to infuse it with personal feeling and sentiment, which directly appealed to the Romantics. Chénier often took traditional forms, like classical elegies and odes, and filled them with sincere personal emotion rooted in his own experiences. The Romantics, who celebrated genuine personal expression, embraced this model. They saw Chénier's work as a way to combine classical structure with a new, modern sensibility. Indeed, in a fragment discovered after his death, Chénier proclaims, "From new thoughts, let us make antique verses," which is now seen as his poetic manifesto. Romantics saw in Chénier's poetry, particularly in his prison poems, a profound sense of melancholy, sorrow, and defiance, all characteristics of their own emotional approach. Interestingly, the Parnassians also claimed Chénier as an influence due to his meticulous adherence to classical structures. Perhaps the most powerful element of André Chénier's legacy for the Romantics was the romantic legend built around his life and death. Chénier was seen as a persecuted genius. The story of a talented poet unjustly killed by a revolution he initially supported captivated the Romantic imagination. His death in the final days of the Terror, just before the end of its bloody reign, amplified the tragedy of his execution. Chénier also became representative of the poet as political martyr. He was seen as the consummate individual artist confronting state-sponsored terror. This theme of the creative spirit struggling against a corrupt world is central to Romanticism. Later artists praised Chénier and contributed to his legendary status. Chateaubriand was one of the first writers to promote André Chénier by quoting the poet in his own works, exposing Chénier to a wider market. This established Chénier as a poet hero, an image that other Romantics like Victor Hugo, Alphonse de Lamartine, and Alfred de Musset. This established Chénier as a poet hero, an image that inspired other Romantics like Victor Hugo, Alphonse de Lamartine, and Alfred de Musset. Chénier became a symbol of resistance, whose courage and devotion made him a tragic hero. Not all of the Romantics blindly followed Chénier's poetic ideals, of course. While Victor Hugo very much appreciated Chénier, he also believed that poetry could take a more balanced approach between the serious and the light. While Chénier uses a classical style and more formal vocabulary to speak about contemporary issues, Hugo argues that we can use everyday language within a classical tradition to convey the poet's message. In this poem, À André Chénier, Hugo addresses André directly, urging him to, pretty literally, stop and smell the flowers, as he gets in touch with the reality of nature. I've excerpted a few lines from the poem so you can see Hugo's approach. Chénier not only appealed to his fellow poets, he also inspired artists of other genres. Here is an 1850 painting by Charles-Louis Muller entitled Call of the Last Victims of the Terror at Saint-Lazare Prison on 7 to 9 Thermidor, an 2. In this painting, we see André Chénier seated in the center of the canvas, alone with a scrap of paper, as others around him languish in the arms of their loved ones. The title lets us know that the poet is in his last days, but also that the terror itself is about to end. Okay, so the last item I want to look at is Andrea Chénier, the opera you'll be seeing. One of the later artists who became intrigued by André Chénier was Umberto Giordano, the Italian composer. His work, Andrea Chénier, is a verissimo opera, which means that it seeks to portray the world with greater realism while still using many romantic themes. Italy, in the 1890s, was undergoing many of the same conditions that France had faced 100 years earlier. Economic hardships, peasant uprisings, and social unrest all served as parallels to Chénier's lifetime. For those of you not familiar with the opera, I'll do some quick summary, but I'll try not to talk too much about it since you'll be seeing the performance later. Andrea Chénier, the Italianized version of the poet's name, is a wealthy young man who is unhappy with the social inequalities around him. The character represents the younger version of the poet, who was from a prominent family and who initially supported the revolution for its message of social equality. The opera became Giordano's most famous work, with its romanticized version of Chénier's life and death. All of the major arias in Andrea Chénier are drawn from the poet's original works and tend to focus heavily on nature. In fact, Chénier's final aria, Come un bel dì di maggio, like a beautiful day in May, is sung as he waits to ascend the scaffold, and is based on one of the poet's final poems, Comme un dernier rayon, like a last ray. Here's a look at how some of the lines compare. I've highlighted lines in different colors that I think are related from the poem to the aria. You can see how many of the lyrics are phrases or ideas pulled from the poet's work. Finally, I wanted to look at some of the settings used in productions. These images are from a Met performance and show how heavily the Revolution plays into any discussion of André Chénier's life and legacy. In the first image on the left, you see the cast creating a crowded ballroom. In the first image on the left, you see the cast creating a crowded ballroom, with the focal point being the dancer lifted above their heads. This image, I think, mimics two famous paintings by David from early in the Revolution. On the top right is the tennis court oath, which we covered earlier. It shows the unity of the three estates and highlights the importance of the constituents' oath. On the bottom right, the Oath of the Horatii portrays a story from antiquity of duty to the state above loyalty to family. Both paintings use a triangular focus to convey their message of unity and a higher power, much like in the opera scene. In the case of the paintings, the higher power is associated with civic virtue and sacrifice for the state. In the second design, we see a revolutionary tribunal, which would have typically been made up of ordinary citizens, often with little government experience or knowledge of laws. Despite this, they held the power of life and death in their hands, and at the height of the frenzy, conducted mock trials that resulted in thousands of executions. In the last image, we see the two lead characters contemplating the overwhelming shadow of the guillotine. Many prisoners were kept in rooms where they could hear and/or see the guillotine and the crowds cheering the executions, adding to the psychological torture. The lyrics and the sets reflect the tumultuous and violent times that André Chénier lived through. His poems written during the Terror capture the chaos, injustice, and horror of the moment, and they provide a model for the Romantics, who often used poetry as a form of protest against oppressive regimes. It is this spirit of poetic defiance that later generations celebrate in Chénier's work. I'm going to end my remarks here. As I mentioned, I don't want to go too deeply into the opera, since you'll be seeing it later. I hope that my information on the Revolution and Chénier's connection to it will allow you to appreciate the historical ties you will see during the performance.